Good afternoon. My name is Raj Charya. Welcome to our second edition of ESG TV webcast as we lead up to the Entrepreneurship and Sustainability Conference later this year. Our topic today is a follow-up from the previous week where we touch on teaching with tech, today's which is theme Time to Act. Our guest today is Brian Cracknell, Director of Language Works. Now, before we delve into that subject at hand, I'm sure many of our viewers are keen to know a bit about your background, Brian. So could you just share with us a bit about your journey and how you ended up here in Malaysia?
Sure. Right. Good afternoon, Raj, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I first came to Malaysia in 1983. Reason being, I was a student of history. I'd studied history of Southeast Asia, and I was very interested in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, and I had an opportunity to come over here. My girlfriend at that time asked me to come to Malaysia for a holiday, so I did, and the short story is I never went back. So in that time, from 1983 onwards, I've been very lucky. I worked at the International Islamic University when it first opened, so we were involved in setting that up. Then I worked for 6 years for British Council and was involved in setting up what is now the Professional Development Unit there in the 1980s. And then after going back to the UK for a short while, I came back to Malaysia in 94. And then the following year, I set up my own company, decided to take the plunge. So we set up Language Works in 1995, starting off as a mainly language learning company. And in the 25 years since then, we've still kept it fairly small and compact in terms of operations, but we've expanded into other areas like project management, teacher training, experiential learning, and of course sustainability, now moving into sort of regenerative learning.
Right, fantastic. Now, it's quite clear you have been in the education industry for quite a fair bit, pre-Y2K and post. So you naturally have seen the evolution of the whole industry before technology and with the evolve of tech to this very day. So how do you see in terms of teaching with tech in this day and age?
All right. Well, firstly, perhaps I should say, I think we overhype and we misuse the word technology. When most people use the word now, I think they mean electronic technology. In fact, I think we've almost become sort of overawed by it. But I would like to quote the example of dialogue, for example, is also a technology, but we can call it a living technology, the application of the science of how we communicate to an actual dialogue between humans. So I think we need to be mindful of not overdoing the tech link up, and particularly now I see a torrent of commentators talking about how it's a given that everything must go online, and even talking about, you know, the end of face-to-face learning. I mean, the topic of today is not to talk about the pandemic specifically and its effects, but in the long term, we're not going to give up face-to-face learning. In the short to medium term, sure, I think the online domain will, let's say, play a bigger role. And of course, coming back to the idea of technology, I think it's important to use tech to support learning, but I don't think it should take it over. I think we've got to kind of look at, you know, what technologies, what methods do students learn best with. So it could be that in some cases, for example, multimedia or an online learning approach would work best. But in other instances, for example, there are some topics that are much better approached and much more easily learned through face-to-face means. And obviously this is going to be more difficult, more challenging to arrange and to set up in these circumstances for the moment. But long term, I think we need to look at technology in a broader view and not be perhaps so awestruck by the wow factor of it. I think obviously in the last 20 years, 25 years or so, there've been some amazing advancements in electronic technology to the point where we just equate technology with electronic technology. But I think if we look at it in a broader context, technology is it encompasses a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, definitely. The human element, for example. Now, you used
absolutely.
a very interesting terminology earlier, at the very beginning, regenerative learning, for example. So could you just enlighten us in the context of education and learning, where does the regenerative part play? And of course, there's another buzzword that's constantly used in this day and age, which is sustainability, which you can probably explain in greater detail later. But let's start off with the regeneration bit of it.
Okay. Well, I think the moment we're in right now just calls for a regenerative approach. I think we've obviously been made to feel as a species that we're rather small in the whole scheme of things. And I think a lot of people have been arguing for a long time that mankind has become too arrogant in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of wildlife extinction, in terms of industrial expansion based on fossil fuels and so on. And we've got to the point where World Overshoot Day, for example, comes earlier and earlier every year, despite everybody's best efforts to sustain whatever it is we're sustaining. So the essence of regenerative learning is basically to regenerate or go back to revisit in a way what we did before. I think we've got to unlearn a lot perhaps of what we've come to do in the modern industrial economy, particularly in terms of education and learning, and look at how do we go back to practices that are not so harmful to the environment. How do we go back to practices that we know will work for people, for the economy as well, obviously, but also for the planet. In terms of regeneration and sustainability, I don't see them as being mutually exclusive. However, I think you said it right there. Sustainability has been hijacked, if we're honest about it. I even hear people in one company talking about, hey, we've been sustainable, we sustained our profits. That's not what it's about at all. So while it's clear companies are increasingly seeing sustainability as key to business success, and there have been a lot of successes. I just see today, I think it's Oxford University in the UK has refused to invest in fossil fuels, for example. So a lot of that ESG in investing, as they call it, is going into more noble causes, let's say, and not into fossil fuels. But we've still got the fact of 97% of living beings now are humans and domesticated animals, with the wildlife being decimated. As I say earlier, we're now, in some people's terms, in the sixth mass extinction, or the Anthropocene age, which is determined by man and his activities. So I think we've got to look again at regenerative, and certainly the other thing, and this is coming into the forefront now with the pandemic, the 1%, as we might call them, those people who've become fabulously rich over the last 20, 30 years, and in whose hands wealth is becoming increasingly concentrated. Richard Branson, for example, is getting a lot of bad press because he's calling for a government bailout. And some people are saying, well, it must be hard, he must be down to his last billion. So, whatever's right or wrong there, I think we've got to look again at, there's obviously an inequity there in the whole system. That so-called trickle-down effect of, we'll all get better off and we'll all be joining in the benefits, obviously hasn't worked. Some people have got fabulously successful, but the losers, if you want to call them that, in the system far outnumber the winners. And surely we have to, revisit what we do and regenerate and completely relook at how we operate in education and in a lot of other domains as well. So I think the regenerative approach is very, very topical, very relevant at this particular moment.
All right. Now, it's interesting that you're looking at it from a world context. And of course, one notable organization is the United Nations, which has introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, or better known as SDGs. So given these developments, where does it leave the SDGs in terms of the bigger scheme of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we have to say that the United Nations, for all its faults, is the best hope we've got for unifying the world in a global response. And some amazing work has been done through the UN. And I particularly remember when the Sustainable Development Goals were introduced, I think around 5 years ago. That really gave us a very strong foundation in teaching sustainability and sustainable project management. And it's a focal point that companies, including our own, we focus our efforts now, our strategies around certain relevant SDGs. So I don't want to knock it too much, that it's something that we've got to go on, and it's something that has given a lot of hope and has brought people's attention to bear into those areas where we really need to be mindful of the effect that we're having on the planet and how we can help people more. But perhaps now it's more clear than ever that despite people's best efforts, we're not really getting anywhere. It's obvious that all of those pledges that the countries made, the signatory countries made 5 years ago, they're not living up to them. It's not working. So you talk about sustainability, the whole word becomes pointless, because what are we sustaining? We're not even sustaining anything, probably. And particularly for young people, this is not something that is going to connect for them and their world, which is going to be very different from ours. So the simple answer is SDGs are still useful. We can use them for planning. We look to them as benchmarks, but I think we've got to look much more at, rather than goals, rather look at a continuous process for how we can regenerate and how we can live within the planetary boundaries, rather than try to dominate them and reach for the stars and our dreams to the detriment of the world that we live in, and that the future generation are going to have to live in.
Yes, makes a lot of sense in that respect. Now, coming back to education and, of course, learning, you touched a little bit on regenerative learning earlier. So what is actually the essence of it? What differentiates it from other learning processes out there? And how did you become so interested in these aspects of learning personally?
Okay, well, I think the whole thing about it is it's nothing new. I think the main thrust behind it, the way I understand it, is that we should just be looking back. I think we've tossed an awful lot of babies out with the bathwater over the last 40, 50 years, as we feel that we've become so much more progressive and so much more advanced and so much more civilized. It's obvious that we haven't, and this latest pandemic is really bringing it home very forcefully. So yes, it's a big crisis for us all, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to perhaps go back to some of these ideas. I mean, just to give you an example, Abraham Maslow, who came up with the famous hierarchy of needs, in the 1930s, he was already talking about how in the future we would be using more arts-based learning, so using theatre, literature, for example, to learn about life in general. And I think there are calls for that. There are many examples already around the world where people are beginning to do this. UNESCO has been involved in this in a big way. So I think the key to it is perhaps, rather than instructing and informing, we're still incredibly linked to the lecture, for example. I mean, universities. How many universities across the world are still using the lecture as the main form of instruction? When that is just one method. I'm not maligning it, it can be very useful, but it's only one method. There are hundreds of others. We don't use enough of them. And I think now we're beginning to see, for example, university higher education is really going to be in crisis, because there just is not going to be enough money around for all but the most hardy of institutions to really ride this out. So I expect to see a lot more innovations in terms of how we educate. Already homeschooling, for example, has taken off in a big way in recent years, where kids are not receiving the majority of their education or any of their education in a traditional school. So I think we've got to be much more interactive. We've got to generate our own ideas. We've got to innovate a lot more. I just took part in a webinar this morning, for example, where MOSTI, Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, were talking about they're going to launch some innovation sandbox projects, which is great news. And this is exactly what is needed. Let's get away from the lecture. Let's get away from the expert, in inverted commas. We need to be generating our own knowledge. We need to be looking at innovations much more and much more quickly. And we need action plans as outcomes from workshops. There's an awful lot of, even at the moment, I see a lot of people setting up well-intentioned, let's discuss this. And there's the usual format, 4 talking heads who are usually male or majority male, talking about the problem that we have, and a silenced audience of 50 or more with nothing, not allowed to contribute in any meaningful way. I think we've really got to get away from that, become much more inclusive, much more interactive, and much more innovative.
Yes, definitely. As they say, action always speaks louder than words at the end of the day. Now, you mentioned regenerative learning, and I'm sure some of our viewers might be keen to find out more information. Where would be a good starting point for them?
There are many really good initiatives going on. I mean, but from my own viewpoint, I'd pick up on three sources. Last year, I went to a conference in Mexico, and it was in Merida, an area of Mexico which is rooted in Mayan culture. And I first heard the term there, ancestral technologies. And I think this is an area that we really need to look at, which is basically what did the ancients do in terms of their civilizations, in terms of their learning? What can we learn from those ancestral civilizations, both in terms of how they failed and also, what they did more simply, if you like. There's also an area, biomimicry. It's amazing that this is treated as a big breakthrough. Hey, why don't we copy what nature does for solutions? Yeah, that would be a really good idea, instead of trying to come up with perhaps a lot of completely new and damaging technologies. So that would be one area, ancestral technologies, biomimicry as topics. As I said, United Nations, UNESCO in particular, has got a curriculum, teaching and learning for a sustainable future. That's got wonderful materials. If you're looking to work with kids and young people, it's got a lot of very good ideas. And that, I would say, is addressed more at, not so much at teachers, but what I would call sus-trainers, people who want to train, who want to teach, but also want to be somebody who is helping with sustainability, helping with regenerative learning. So that's a very different kind of approach in that curriculum, which I think is something for the future. And just in the last few days, with the lockdown and everything, I thought, let's do an online course. So I signed up for Post Carbon Institute. They have a self-guided course, video-based course called Think Resilience. So this is another word that's coming to the fore now. How do we make ourselves more resilient? And we're going to need to know more about this as things progress with in the health sphere, for example. And this is extremely interesting. It gives you a sort of overview as well about all the different, what seemingly could be a very sort of complex picture of, where we need to regenerate, where we need to practice sustainability, where we need to think resilience. And as I say, it's self-guided, and I'm about halfway through that at the moment, working through it gradually. So in terms of topics, ancestral technologies and biomimicry worth looking at. In terms of a curriculum, UNESCO teaching and learning for a sustainable future. And in terms of going beyond curriculum and something that's a very nice self-contained, self-guided learning, Post-Carbon Institute, Think Resilient. And they also, on their website, have a lot of really good references. There's books there, articles, but a lot of videos, which if you're like me, you tend to prefer seeing a quick 5-minute video rather than going into a whole book. So there's a lot of material there if people are interested in checking that out.
So you mentioned video earlier, which is obviously one of the tools that's used in the whole learning process. So where do you see edutainment in terms of learning for our generation moving forward?
Oh, so again, this is one of those very malleable words in edutainment. You could also turn it around a little bit and call it entertrainment. Yes, I know a trainer who calls herself the entertrainer. So basically this means combining elements of enjoyment and entertainment with learning activity in order to make the learning more stick more. Again, I think sometimes it can be abused if we're just treating it. It becomes more more entertain than education. I think we've got to sort of keep a look at. It's like gamification as well. This is another great technique, but you've got to keep focused on, you know, what is the learning outcome, and that there is a learning outcome from it. We don't just end up entertaining ourselves. So in that sense, it's got a big role to play. I think, you know, we're seeing convergence in all sorts of domains, and this is just one area where we're seeing what used to be two compartmentalized areas coming together for benefit. And yes, you can do some fantastic things. One of the areas that we have done down the years in Language Works is a series of experiential learning workshops called, one unit is called Time to Act. So basically we work with large groups of people using theatre, poetry, drawing, the arts in general as entertaining techniques. But the aim is to get them to come up with an output or an action plan, which they then connect back to their workplace or their place of study. So, yeah, I mean, edutainment's obviously one of those techniques that can be deployed to amazing effect, very powerful effect with all different sorts of groups.
Fantastic, Brian. Well, we're almost out of time right now. So if you could just ask you one final question, probably answering in the next minute or so, given the MCO that we're all enduring right now. So how have you embodied the regenerative approach while stuck at home?
Yes, good question. Okay, first of all, by connecting and reconnecting with people. So I've, you know, hooked up again with friends back in the UK and elsewhere, connecting with people who perhaps haven't been in touch with for a while here. And also we're going to be just a quick plug, we're going to be launching a new sort of series of mini interviews called Bound to Connect, B2C, beginning of next week, where we interview 3 people who we know, and we emphasize this importance of this connecting and reconnecting. So that's one thing I've been doing. I've been working with you guys on how we're going to organize the second Entrepreneurship and Sustainability Conference. Been doing the online course and joining up for webinars as this morning with the MOSTI, one in the European Union, Malaysia Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Also a bit of gardening, doing more cooking, nothing too elaborate. Keeping up exercising. I've managed to get my weight down to normal level. And of course, thinking about planning for and beginning now to act on opportunities for reimagining what we do, because as everybody says, you know, it's a new a new abnormal, if you like. So we have to adapt to that, and we've got to think about how we're going to proceed in that new disrupted world.
Right, fantastic. Brian, thank you so much for your time today
to
have this interview with us. And there you have it, Brian Cracknell, Director, Language Works. And with that, this concludes this edition of ESG TV webcast for this week. Do stay tuned in the weeks to come for more riveting topics. On behalf of ESG TV, my name is Raj Arya. Till the next time.